Hi, everyone. Everybody can hear me? Oh, sounds like you can hear me. Excellent. Well, as you heard, I am Marc Zienkiewicz. I'm editor for Seed World Canada and the Alberta Seed Guide. And welcome to today's panel discussion. We're talking about a really important topic today, specifically the future of plant breeding in Canada. And welcome my esteemed panelists today. Now, we all know the success of any initiative that we do in this industry, in this sector, depends on more than just ideas. It's about collaboration and really ensuring that everyone's voice is heard and valued. But the big question is, how do we move beyond just consultation and just beyond talking and have real action? So this chat we're going to have today about the future of plant breeding in Canada, we've been talking about this for about 10 years, over 10 years now. And we haven't really had a ton of action in this regard. So that's the whole point about our conversation today, how we can build initiatives that really resonate with the people they're meant to serve so we can get that long-term impact and buy-in. So our panelists today are Rob Graff, is a board member for the Alberta-British Columbia Seed Growers. He's also science advisor for SeedNet. And he's a retired winter wheat breeder for AAFC here in Alberta. Rob actually bred, as many of you know, some of Canada's best-known winter wheat varieties, including AAC Wildfire and AAC Network. Welcome, Rob. Curtis Pozniak, beside Rob, is wheat breeding professor and director of the Crop Development Center at the University of Saskatchewan. Curtis has bred some of Canada's most well-known durum varieties like CD Seed Defy. Welcome, Curtis. Ricky Yada is Dean of Agriculture, Life and Environmental Sciences at the University of Alberta. He's also currently the North American editor of Trends in Food Science and Technology, and serves on the editorial board of several journals. Welcome, Ricky.
Thanks, Mark.
Jody Suter is a Nuffield scholar and founder of J4 Agriscience, based in Saskatchewan. And Jody really brings unique perspective to this panel today on how areas, both as a farmer and a plant breeder, on how both of these areas can be strengthened and how additional plant breeding efforts are needed for future success in grain production. Holly Mayer is Director, Science Partnerships Division for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Science and Technology Branch. She's also developed a lot of guidance for AAFC's investments in beef and forage research, development, and technology transfer. Welcome, Holly. And last but not least, François Eudes is actually wearing two hats. He's Research, Development, and Technology Director for AAFC's Science and Technology Branch here in Alberta. He's also the National AAFC Science Lead for the Breeding Innovation and Crop Germplasm Development Portfolio for AAFC, which captures their science capacity related to breeding. Wow, that's quite a mouthful. Welcome, François. Can we give our panelists a big round of applause, please? And if you're wondering about my qualifications and what makes me so well suited to facilitating this panel, if you weren't here last night for the dinner theater, I won the Bumbling Fool Award for giving the worst answer ever. So you're in hands with me up here. So I just want to begin by setting the stage here for everyone. Like I said, we've been talking for like a decade now in our industry about the future of plant breeding, and we really need a strategy for moving forward. It's a conversation, like I said, where we haven't had a ton of action in this space, especially when it comes to cereal and pulse development. Everyone needs to be on the same page if we're going to do something to come up with a strategy for the future of plant breeding in Canada. François, I want to start with you. AAFC's role in the plant breeding landscape is evolving. You were actually on our cover of Seed World Canada back in July. And that was, I believe, a quote I had from you right on the cover was about the evolution of AAFC's plant breeding strategy. Can you start by making clear for everyone, for all of us in this room, what that means and what the implications are for the people here today?
I'll try my best to answer your question and make it clear. Certainly, AAFC has a long history and success in plant breeding. We've been in this business for more than 100 years. But you can imagine over the time that the science and the way we conduct science has evolved in order to respond to the challenge that farmers are experiencing at the farm level, the needs of the seed sector, but also just because science in itself is evolving over time. So our science capacity in breeding is today described as a breeding continuum, and it involves a number of science disciplines beyond genetics and quantitative genetics, which has been the core of breeding. So today, you heard a lot about genomics, probably heard about gene editing. So science disciplines that require all the experts than the experts in genetics and quantitative genetics. A number of science disciplines are coming up to complement the portfolio of science experts that we have on staff and help generate this new series of innovations that are going to be captured in that seeds that you are going to put on the market. So that require quite a lot of effort, require building the capacity in terms of recruiting new science experts in these emerging science disciplines. You, I'm sure, heard a lot also about, and you are probably seeing it in your own life, how computing science, the emerging artificial intelligence are changing the way we conduct a number of things in our life. It's the same in science. Data science is today a very important science discipline that is also incorporated in that breeding continuum. So for us to continue to be relevant, to be able to bring this innovation up to the farm, we have to also build that capacity and be present in these other science disciplines which appear to be further away from the market in that breeding continuum. And to make sure there is this linkage with the plant breeding or genetics, crop germplasm development, so the innovation can move from or across the different science program up to the development of a field-ready variety. So you heard that AAFC is, or you hear this rumor that AAFC is moving away from plant breeding. AAFC is committed to plant breeding. It's just that we see our role, our contribution shifting, changing, and recognizing that other partners, we're not the only science providers, we are not the only science organization developing this new genetic material that you put on the market. And so it's important for us to look at a different model, a way where we would be working collaboratively with other players, and in some cases, when the time is right, working on that transition where we would be mobilizing our science capacity mostly in that upstream area of science disciplines and making sure that the path to the market is not broken, working with various collaborators to take this innovation to the market. So that's the type of transition, which will take time. I'm sure we're going to talk about example of transition.
Absolutely, we will. So Holly, considering what François just said, what are the risks for our sector, for our industry of relying on government to just continue plant breeding work in the future?
Well, I think that's a good question because it's not one I think that people typically would think to ask themselves or talk about. Like François said, we've been here for over 100 years, and generally our breeders put varieties on the market that do well. So where's the risk in that situation, I think, is probably what people would think first. I do see risks, though, and I think one of them is that there is such a high dependence in the system in general to relying on AFC, that within the system, so to speak, the ecosystem of the organizations that are doing plant breeding, AFC plays a significant role. Our land is used for variety trials, not just by ourselves, but by other breeders. We have a network of research centers and land across the country that's utilized quite widely by not just ourselves, but other breeding organizations. Infrastructure, not just the land, but the infrastructure that we have, again, is spread out across the country and needed. But as you'll hear, I think, from the universities in particular, infrastructure is expensive. And we work on, I think, more of a fixed budget than many people realize. So we are subject to financial pressures. We don't have significant or even much increases in our budget to work with to keep that infrastructure up to date where we need it. We compete for people that the universities are training for us, but increasingly we rely on scientists actually from outside of the country too. So there's definitely some risks there on the science side. I think, too, the funding that Agriculture Canada provides through the Agri-Science program in particular presents another risk. That is a program. Programs are a mechanism to affect policy direction or a vehicle for policy direction. And so as government priorities change, and we've seen that over the lifetime of that program, the funding what you have to do to get the funding changes. So I think even backing up one step from there, the fact that there is such a significant reliance on the Agri-Science program to fund breeding is a risk in and of itself. It's a 5-year program. All the clusters are competing against each other. So pulses are competing against wheat, are competing against dairy, are competing against pork, so to speak, for those funds, which again have largely been fixed. That's really not an ideal way to be funding any kind of breeding program. And the decisions on that funding in the end are left with government, not to say that we don't have some perspectives and knowledge in there, but it's again, I'd say, far from the ideal way. So there's a couple of buckets of risk there, I think, for sure.
So Rob, as someone who was a wheat breeder for AAFC for many years, as you just heard, AAFC might be moving away from field-ready cultivar development, more upstream research in the future. As someone who's been in both the public and private sector breeding worlds, as I said, you're now with SeedNet, and before you were with AAFC, you're actually with private industry then as well. What are the consequences for everybody in this room of not having an established system in place to fill any void that is left by this shift?
Yeah, and I think that's the million-dollar question right now. In Western Canada, in just about every crop other than canola, I mean, it's either AAFC or crop development center varieties that are among the most popular varieties out there. And as we shift away from AAFC delivering field-ready cultivars or reducing their capacity to deliver field-ready cultivars, I think the consequences could be quite dire. I think most of my comments are going to be on wheat because that's the crop I know best. And if you take a look at what's happened over the past 3 decades or so, there was funding that went into plant breeding programs, both at the Crop Development Center and other universities, and as well as AAFC, to bolster what we did. And that was first through WGRF, through the Canadian Wheat Board checkoff, and now through a checkoff that the commissions administer. And so this bolstered the programs, and initially back in the late 90s, actually effectively doubled the size of our breeding programs and allowed us to do a lot of good things. If you take a look in wheat, you'll often hear reports and so on that cereals are lagging behind in terms of the rate of genetic increase. And Canada is actually a bright spot. And there's recent evidence to show that compared to the EU, compared to the United States, compared to Argentina, and China, in fact, we are actually increasing our yields at a faster rate than any of those jurisdictions. In addition, what did we do during that time? Not only did we increase yields, we largely, put a large emphasis on Fusarium head blight resistance. We had to start incorporating stripe rust resistance as well, in addition to the other diseases that were traditionally problems across our area. So that's kind of the background. And as soon as we move away from breeders looking at the populations, looking at the crosses and so on, and the segregants from those populations, fewer, as Ron DePauw would put it, fewer hands in the pans and boots in the field, we will generally not be able to find those rare segregants that will take us to that next level of productivity. And so that's, without a system in place to actually encourage private plant breeding within the sector to fill the void, I think we're very much in a dire consequence. And the thing about it is, you're not going to notice right away. Plant breeding is one of those things, you hear it all the time. It takes 10 years, it takes 12 years to get something to market from the initial cross. So what is coming out in the next 5 years is already in the pipeline. It's further back than that. And so by the time we see a problem, it's largely going to be too late, and it's going to be a huge effort to claw our way back.
Curtis, you're both wheat breeder and now director of the CDC, and you're responsible for determining, what the CDC, where it's going to go in terms of its research, where it's going to allocate its priorities. What's the big opportunity, but also the biggest challenge for the CDC as we look toward a potentially much different plant breeding landscape in Canada?
Yeah, thanks. So this is something that I think about a lot, and I would argue it's been way more than 10 years that we've been talking about this. And in fact, as I was renovating my office a few weeks back, I came across some older documents that maybe even from Brian Harvey's day, talking about shifting priorities in plant breeding and who's going to do what and how to encourage private sector investment. So we've been talking about this for a long time. And I think the opportunity at the Crop Development Center is really to step up as Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada sort of has signaled they'll move away from development of field-ready cultivars. Our intent is to stay in that space, to be really a driving force in public plant breeding innovation and development of new varieties. And we really believe and live that we do need public capacity to support plant breeding, improving the existing crops that we already have. Many of those crops actually that we work on in the Crop Development Center are minor crops where private sector may not be interested in investing in because it's just difficult to get a good return on investments. Or improving new uses or developing new uses for the crops that we already have. That's a significant part of the work that we do at the Crop Development Center, and we'll continue to do that. We really need stability in plant breeding programs. It's not an off-on thing, and private sector will invest, and sometimes they'll pull back, and there's risk when that happens. We want to make sure that we do have public programs that are continuing that momentum. And We hear a lot about technology and innovation, and I think CDC is really unique in that we bridge the continuum from foundational research all the way to the development of field-ready cultivars, and that was really the vision when the CDC was established back in 1971, and that integration within the Department of Plant Sciences, the College of Agriculture, and the collaborative space that brings is so important, so that we can not just do research for the sake of doing research, but the research that we do is actually plant breeding driven. It starts with the plant breeders and works its way back. So that's something that's important. And I think having public plant breeding capacity is equally important from a training perspective. Having well-funded programs that are developing field-ready cultivars is an excellent and I think an essential need to train graduate students and the next generation of plant breeders and all the technologies that we talk about. Technology has always been here, and plant breeders are very innovative at taking the newest and latest in technologies and converting that into field-ready cultivars. So that's something that we're going to continue to do. But obviously there's challenges, and those challenges are really around sufficient long-term stable funding to support that capacity growth. And Holly mentioned about the infrastructure piece. That's certainly top of mind for us as we look to implement a growth plan, in fact, that we've put together at the Crop Development Center. Infrastructure and people are a top priority. And so we need stable, long-term investments in our breeding programs to make sure that we can continue delivering on our mission to develop field-ready cultivars.
So Ricky, like the University of Saskatchewan does, University of Alberta is responsible for literally generating the next generation of plant breeders. And why is now a really crucial time to bolster U of A's capacity in that regard, particularly when it comes to, say, like student programs and things like that?
Well, thanks, Mark. Maybe before I answer that question, just for the background for these people in the audience. So previously to coming to the U of A, I was at the University of British Columbia, where I was the Dean of Agriculture there. And there's a couple of challenges that I've faced in moving to Edmonton. One is adapting to the weather. So you can probably see I'm still wearing shorts. So that's a big challenge. The other one is if you're in Edmonton, my God, if you're not an Oilers fan, you're a pariah. But I found out that even worse than that, if you're a Flames fan in Edmonton. So I hope, for those of you who are a Flames fan, don't take offense, because I'm on the same bandwagon as you being a Canucks fan. But, Mark, to answer your question, why is it important right now? Well, we're seeing evidence of this right now all over the world with climate change, and things that, were grown down the south will probably be grown in the north. And we need to prepare our students for these, future situations. But we also need to actually, and I think François talked about this and Holly talked about this, we really need to redefine what agriculture is today. Agriculture is a high-tech industry. It's a multidisciplinary industry, as François was talking and Holly was talking about, and Curtis, you were also talking about this. We have big data. I was just reviewing a paper this morning just before I came down as in my editorial role about the use of machine learning, artificial intelligence to actually data mine some of the data that we have in order to optimize experiments. And so that's part of the drill. We need to equip our students with the latest tools. So as I said to our faculty, yes, we've had this tradition of being a very strong agricultural faculty, and the stereotypic image is, tractors and pitchforks. but we need to expand that. We really do. And plant breeding is no different than any of the other disciplines. You know, there is big data that's being looked at in order to optimize things. There's new omic tools that allow us to actually do better selection. And so if we arm our students with the latest educational assets, then I think we'll be prepared to face these challenges rather than reacting to them.
So we've established we've got like a pretty serious issue in our sector. AAFC is transitioning its plant breeding investment, and we need the seed sector to come to the table with ideas for innovating in this new environment. Now, Jody, you're a former student of the University of Saskatchewan. You started up your own plant breeding company. You could have joined a big conglomerate, big company, been a part of, but you decided to go out on your own, start up your own company and do this like DIY, doing it yourself. It's a tall order considering what we're talking about here, the kind of environment that we have right now. Why did you feel like now is the time that, you know what, I really need, even though it's going to be really hard, I really need to do this? Why was now the time for you to start J4 Agri-Science?
Yeah, and it was why I started J4 Agri-Science was because of the signals that we were starting to see that AAFC was moving to a more pre-breeding role. So I grew up on a farm in northeastern Saskatchewan, and then I started J4 Agri-Science in 2019. And as Marc mentioned before, I also did a Nuffield project looking at private plant breeding, because in Canada, it's not something that we've utilized like other countries around the world have. You know, and I'm talking about the small startups, the homegrown private plant breeding that other countries have. And so for me, why I started it is I saw the need. As I was going through grad school, a lot of the crops that I was interested in only had activity from one breeding program. And it was a very good breeding program, but the entire industry, the stool of the entire industry was resting on that one leg. And plant breeders are human, and we only have 24 hours in the day like anybody else does. And it really was a risk of the industry leaving our entire industry for some of these crops on one leg of the stool. And so I saw the opportunity. I said, grew up on a farm. So, you know, our grain sector is very entrepreneurial and very business focused. Our seed world is very entrepreneurial and very business focused. So I wanted to try to replicate that in the breeding space. And yeah, I went around the world looking at trying to figure out why these people like me don't exist in Canada, even though they exist around the world and are bringing really innovative traits to farmers and commercializing really interesting varieties around the world. And it's just a passion of mine trying to get more options for farmers, more options for seed growers, and making sure we're hedging the bets of the industry in any way that we can.
So Jody, what challenges, like what's the big challenge you're facing now in terms of you as a private, DIY plant breeder? You're starting out, you're doing this yourself. What are the big challenges you're facing that make you think like, okay, alarm bells going off, we need to take action now in our sector. We need a plan. What's that big challenge that just sets off those alarm bells for you?
Yeah. DIY sounds so Pinteresty. We're a true breeding company. Yeah, there's a lot of challenges. And I mean, around the world, we've seen it's a very common thing, I think, around the world that the public sector, the government, breeding has become a more pre-breeding or early on in the research and development of plant breeding. For instance, in the UK, the government in the UK started shifting during Margaret Thatcher's era, which is 40 years ago. And in Australia, the government has shifted to more of a pre-breeding focus and really tried to allow the industry to develop. And yeah, it does, as Rob mentioned, it takes time. Plant breeding takes time. You can't start a company and 6 months later have something on the ground. And so I think for us, we didn't get, although we've been talking about this for 10, 15 years, we never really got that pain point that, say, the UK did when the government just walked out immediately. And so we haven't been driving the change at the rate that we probably should have, because we were getting all of these signals. And so, yeah, that's literally why I started our company, because somebody had to try. Somebody had to figure out how we can get extra competition in this space, because as Rob mentioned, we're not going to feel the lack maybe this year or next year, but we're going to feel the lack of diverse varieties 10, 15, 20 years from now. And we need to be doing something today to hedge our bets for that in the future.
So, François and Holly, competition is something that tends to be really synonymous with the private sector, right? Like, we know the private sector competes, competition is important. We don't often associate that necessarily with the public sector. But I think, Holly, you said earlier that, you've got all these public sector breeding programs, they're all competing with each other. And so competition is something that is taking place every day in the public sector as well. As far as cereals and pulses go, how do you see Canada's current plant breeding system, the way it is now, really impacting innovation in terms of competition? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, how's AAFC working with other parties as it makes this transition? And are there examples that you can each give us? So I'll start with you, François.
Yeah, so when we look at this ecosystem, it's always one crop, one commodity within its own context. And context, Canada is a big country. There's different agro-ecosystem. There's different players, stakeholders across the country. So we have to acknowledge this, as well as the capacity that exists. Canada still has a few homegrown businesses, either owned by producers or family-owned. And so that's part of this ecosystem. In some case, there is, in that ecosystem, already some players with whom we could co-develop that new model, repositioning AAFC contribution. So we move away from being a direct competitor from this nascent business in Canada, or family-owned breeding business, to becoming that innovation partner. As a public science organization, so public, obviously, contrary to private sector, our raison d'être is different. And that's where I think we have to rethink about that contribution that we bring to the sector. And when the time is right, to be able to reposition this contribution. So again, every crop in its own context. We're doing right now, we're walking a transition to the VLP breeding program in Lacombe. The decision was made at the beginning of the sustainable cap 5 years agreement, and we're giving ourselves that timeline, 5 years, to walk a transition. Recognizing that in this particular context, there are other players. There's private companies. CDC also is in VLP breeding. So essentially, there's 5 other players in that ecosystem. So that's a great example where we could work with these other players as we would be shifting our science effort from finishing field-ready variety, where we have been very successful, to focusing on the pre-breeding space up to the foundational science to generate that next innovation and making sure we have that path up to, these companies who are going to finish, or players, universities and companies, who are going to finish the field-ready VLP variety. Now, here I think the context was quite favorable for working on a transition over that period of time. So we're still committed to this transition to the end of sustainable cap, which is end of March 2028. In other commodity, it's a different story. You mentioned cereals and pulse. Well, cereals, we haven't built that capacity yet in Prairie region in particular. And so to be able to work on the transition in cereals, wheat, barley, oats, is going to take much more time. But that doesn't mean we should not start today to identify people like Jody who wants to move into plant breeding and work with them, help them to be successful. And I think that's part of that shift in AAFC role, recognizing that we've been a competitor. We serve the industry well, but we've been a competitor to a number of other players who may have had an opportunity or may want today to make a step into plant breeding. And it's important to ask ourselves, how can we help them to be successful?
Holly, is there an example that you like to point to? François was just mentioning the Field Pea program in Lacombe. Is there one in particular that to you illustrates this practice of AAFCs to sort of reach out to that wider community?
Well, I think the Field Pea one is the best example we have of a shift, and François said it well, because the context has allowed that. In the kind of broader picture, and as I talked about earlier, I mean, we work very closely with the other plant breeding organizations that are out there. And so the universities definitely are a key part there. I think that the colleges have a greater role to play potentially than what they do now. There's some colleges that have, are stepping a little bit more into doing some of the closer to market work related to variety development. But I think there's opportunity potentially for them to have a greater role. They obviously play a role in terms of training of people as well that are needed. It's not just scientists. There's an army of others behind the scientists, so to speak, that take care of the fields, know how to take care of the plots, run the plot combines, all those kinds of things too. And for AFC, for sure, I also for the universities, certainly we have a very long history of partnership with producers through the checkoffs that Rob was talking about. And so, we sit at the table with them and talk about where their money's going and why, and, where it's shifting a bit and what our programs are doing. Those are ongoing conversations for sure with producers and a really important part of this discussion.
So funding, money, we're hearing from Curtis, Ricky, Jody, François, Holly, Rob. I mean, we've got all these great ideas, things we need to do, but we need funding to do this. And so, Rob, as an AAFC researcher for a lot of years, you saw the impact of changes, these shifting priorities in terms of funding. We've got a lot of funding sources right now. We've got, federal government funding. There's checkoffs, trailing royalties like the VUA, certified seed sales. It's good to have a variety of funding sources, but I mean, it's clear we can't just, fall back on the existing system and just rely on it to somehow fill this void that could be left as AAFC transitions its investments. Is there something we've missed? And what is that, Rob? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think there's any magic answer to this. Ultimately, if there's going to be more interest in plant breeding and delivery of field-ready cultivars, we need to have an ecosystem that promotes a return on investment so that those companies, those individuals who are involved in delivery of field-ready cultivars actually can see a return on investment so that they can further invest and improve their programs and make further innovations. What that means exactly is certainly up in the air. I think, as the world becomes more urbanized, people are starting to forget where their food comes from. and where crops come from. And so this is a huge challenge. And so I think there's still a big role for the federal government, for governments to invest in plant breeding and in field-ready cultivar development. One of the things Holly was saying is, Agriculture Canada partnering with universities and colleges and so on, and that's well and good. It's an important segment in terms of training future plant breeders and so on. But really what it's doing is shifting from one public purse to another. And we need to have a system in place where we can start to see the emergence of much more private industry involved in plant breeding and make it attractive for international companies, for homegrown companies to actually flourish here. And so what does that mean? I think it certainly means that AAFC, as the federal funder for agriculture, needs to invest in these types of things, in startups, perhaps. That might be one. There used to be a great program within Ag Canada. François benefited from it. I benefited from it years ago. It was called the Matching Investment Initiative. And private money, Ag Canada could be approached with private money. And if it fit the objectives of the branch, of research branch, there would actually be matching money that would go into the researcher's program. So maybe that needs to be rethought a little bit. And this program ended over 20 years ago. But what if, as was mentioned, I work part-time for SeedNet. What if SeedNet had a pot of money and said, hey, Jody, we'd like you to do something for us. And with that, we approach Ag Canada and say, if it fits within their objectives, they would say, yeah, you know what, we'll double your money or even triple your money, and you go and do what those guys want you to do. All of a sudden, it changes the narrative. And that's just one example off the top of my head. I mean, I don't have the answers. I mean, I'm sure there's a huge diversity of opinion on that and lots of ideas out there. One thing I often think about, and I think a lot of breeders favor the system, and that is the endpoint royalty system. And that's a scary word for a lot of people. But when you consider wheat, in Canada, and I'm talking all of Canada now, not just Western Canada, but over the past 5 years, we actually produce over 1 billion bushels of wheat every year. That's the average. So if there was a checkoff of some kind, or an endpoint royalty, I guess I should say, of 1 cent a bushel, that would generate $11 million if everything was captured. And so I don't know what the level of endpoint royalty would have to be, but I think it would certainly change the narrative around return to investment and make Canada a much more favorable place to invest in plant breeding by private industry. Because right now, I started my career with Saskatchewan Wheat Pool. There was a breeding program. It ended because there was not enough return on investment. And I transitioned to Agriculture Canada. We've seen the same happen with Syngenta, and that program's various incarnations before that. Who knows? We may see it again. And so we really need to change that whole ecosystem. And, endpoint royalties, I know, are scary, particularly for seed growers, because we know that it doesn't favor the use of pedigreed seed in the industry, or at least that was the experience in Australia. I think there are ways to make it actually favorable for pedigreed seed, and in fact could encourage pedigreed seed.
Curtis, I see you nodding your head quite a bit, and I think that's because the CDC is already doing a lot of these things. You said you're developing field-ready cultivars through program-based breeding approaches rather than focusing solely on project-based activities. And can you talk for a minute about like the big advantage to the CDC of really maintaining that program-based approach compared to just a shorter-term project-based model?
Right. Well, maybe let me define them. I think, program-based funding would be what I'd consider more long-term stable funding that really supports the core breeding activities. The people, the infrastructure, the contra-season nurseries, the technologies that we use. So having that sort of program-based funding that's long-term ensures that we have the people in place, good people, and so that we can retain them, pay them well, and make sure that they're committed to the work that we do. When I think of project-based funding, I think more sort of short-term, sort of 3-4 year projects, often very hypothesis-driven, very focused on an individual problem, solving a small little problem. Plant breeding is a program. We often say a plant breeding program, and so it's important, and we have this the separation and define the funding in terms of program-based activities for the work that we do, and we do that largely through partnerships. So I can. For example, at the CDC, we have about a $40 million operating budget, including the research that we do. About a third of it is from government, a third of that is from growers, and a third is actually from industry. And those partnerships are key because, if I think about our relationships with industry, they bring something to the table, we bring something to the table. And the sum is greater than the individual parts. For example, we have a very close collaboration with Corteva in durum wheat, where we're looking to modify the nutritional profile. And they've brought a technology to Western Canada. They're not interested in developing their own plant breeding program, perhaps because they don't see the return on investment yet. But they've partnered with us, and we bring the expertise in terms of germplasm, integrating it into our genetic material, doing the appropriate testing in the appropriate agroecological zones, moving it forward through variety registration, and then partnering on commercialization. So that's sort of our strategy, around program funding is working closely with government, growers, and industry to really support the core breeding activities that we do. Most certainly, return on investment is important to all of our stakeholders, and we want to deliver on that. And I think as I'm interacting more and more with industry partners, it's clear that there's multiple paths to return on investment for them. And we have to engage them in the conversation, I think, to understand what works for them so that we can sort of coexist with public and private breeding programs in a way that's truly synergistic.
So Ricky, operational costs are huge for any university. Sometimes we think about funding, we think of, private companies and things, but we don't have to think of universities. I mean, you need funding as much as anybody else to fund your operations. And I'm just curious, Ricky, who all needs to be at the table in order to really consider that issue of operational costs?
Yeah, Mark, I think the simple answer is everyone who's in this room and who represents the various organizations. It's interesting, Mark, I had a discussion with our president, Bill Flanagan, and Bill was saying, in light of the fact that there's not going to be a lot more provincial transfer money to the universities, which basically funds the operational costs, we're going to have to think of creative ways. And I said to Bill, I think we're going to have to change the narrative of our discussions with our organizations that partner with the university. And the argument I put forward to Bill was, if they don't step up, we won't be able to run the university. We won't be able to educate or train the students who are the employees of all of you in the room who represent organizations or associations. So I said, we really need to think of how we partner with the various organizations to look at different funding models. And, it's not to say that we don't appreciate the research that you support or the scholarships that you give to our students. But our big challenge right now is how do we fund the operational costs? And, this week, the thing that's been keeping me up at night is how do we replace faculty in light of diminishing budgets? All of us, I think, who are with the government or industry have faced those challenges. How do you actually fund or even maintain research programs? And Curtis, I'll make a comment about programs and projects. I think if you get the program right, you can handle projects. Because my worry about funding projects is what I saw when I was back at Guelph. The Ministry of Ag would put out a call for a specific thematic area. People would ramp up, and then 5 years down the road, they're going, nope, that isn't a priority anymore. And we're left with this infrastructure that we've ramped up and an expertise. So, I don't think that we should be, really project-oriented. We should be program-oriented and get it right. And I'm going to make a comment about François' word on competition. Competition to me is great for sporting activities. For agriculture, we can't afford to be competitive. We need to be collaborative. So I just put forward to Minister Searson a proposal where I said, Minister, I think it would be incumbent on us to actually develop a database of the research, the expertise, the infrastructure in the province so that we have a consolidated database so that people can come through a portal and find out who has what and who knows what. Because I think we don't have even the luxury of time to do what, the young people do really well, a Google search, right? If I were to argue what is the most valuable non-renewable resource, it's not oil or gas, it's time. No one has time now. And with diminishing resources, our time is even more precious. So I think the question is, how do you fund the operational costs? Well, I think we need to all chip in and belly up to the bar.
I think the word that's coming to mind for me, Ricky, is momentum. We need momentum because you can't get people around a table unless those people realize, oh, I need to be at that table. Otherwise, you're going to have a bunch of empty chairs, right? And so Jody, you mentioned earlier, or Rob mentioned earlier, the need for mechanisms. He was talking a little bit about endpoint royalties, the need for something to ensure that, breeders like you, Jody, get a return on their investment. What do you see as the biggest barrier to that discussion right now, and what would help us get the momentum that we need to do that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I learned from my Nuffield is that we're often talking and we don't actually do the work to get the job done. We know breeders need a return on investment. It's guaranteed, and I think that's across the board, private and public. And that return on investment will actually help stabilize things. We see in Alberta how funding sources can come and go and completely shut down plant breeding programs when the funding sources are removed or a change in government happens and a priority is different, or somebody new comes to the table and has a completely different priority. We need a stable source of funding so that the people that are in the field can keep doing their job no matter what the circumstance. In 2022, I remember at Crops Fair, at the Crop Production Services, One of the lead economists on this topic, Richard Gray, said it was at an APAS, so an Agricultural Producers Association of Saskatchewan meeting. He was asked what the worst model was, what the worst system was, or what the best system and the worst system was. And his answer is the worst option is staying the same. And so that was, almost 5 years ago now. And we thankfully have the VOA, which is allowing someone like me to come to the table, like it or, not like it. At least it's something. The people who put the VOA together stepped up to the table. And I think just in general, we need people to accept that to stabilize this industry, we need a funding source. Plant breeding is an amazing investment. It is such a good investment. So the University of Saskatchewan, the CDC, did an economic study for return on investment, and the CDC also has the mandate to teach and do other things. And I think the lowest return on investment was flax, which went through the triffid years during the study. And it was for every $1 that went in, farmers got $6 back. Wheat was somewhere in the $1 to $20. And I think lentils was $1 to $46. We can't make that return on investment in any other way. So for farmers, for growers, having that ability to get money in will yield so much for our industry. And so we need to figure out how to get that stable investment to get the innovation, and for us on the farming side see the benefit.
François, in terms of working together, and how can we in this room best help you ensure that this transition AAFC is going through is really going to work, not just for AAFC, but for everybody? What do you need from us in order to do that?
Well, I think it needs it's only the conversation, the communication. It also means for all the stakeholders to join in that co-development of this new, again, to be developed Canadian model. As I mentioned earlier, it's really every commodity in its own context. So each conversation is going to be different. But it has to be a joint effort. I think we are at the point where, yes, the statu quo is not sustainable, either economically or in terms of capacity. So we need to get a broader engagement in defining how the future could look like. So it's not just for the federal government to come up with a magic solution. It is for all of us to create that future.
Ollie, what can we do to help you?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's frustrating for sure for those in the room that have been having this discussion. I'm going to say for much longer even than 15 years, that we're still here. And it's because it is a really hard conversation to have. And I think the longer that we exist in the status quo and don't pursue alternatives that are going to bring stability, I think that's an excellent word, stability and sustainability to the system, the greater the risk is that the system breaks in a way that we don't want it to. There's no one sort of magic one-liner that says this is exactly what the problem is. I think you're hearing from everybody here that money is a problem, and for the most part, we're all competing against each other for the same resources, many of which come from government. And it's been articulated well, the issues of money that comes from government, right? It's not farmers that are making that decision, so to speak, in the end. A different funding model where farmers are deciding, these are the varieties that I want to grow. There's enough value there that I'm willing to pay a little bit extra, whatever that looks like. That money then goes back to that breeder that generated that value, right? That it's the beginning or the basis of a much more stable funding system, but a hard conversation to have, particularly with farmers. And so I think that collectively amongst us, there needs to be, like François said, a willingness, a desire to be open-minded, to recognize that there are problems, to engage in conversations with, for you folks as seed growers, your farmer customers, your farmer neighbors, about the system itself. You know, what is happening? What did you hear here today? And take a bit of a stand to say, we do need to think about how to do things differently so that there are more people in the room who understand and acknowledge that there is a need to do things differently and are willing to have that conversation.
Rob, you and I talked a little bit about this last night about, changing minds, getting people to think about things differently. And yeah, how can we, as someone who's been public, private sectors, you've talked with, seed growers, seed companies, plant breeders, you've kind of dipped your toe into all of it. How can we best, facilitate that conversation?
Well, I think, many of the people in this room, of course, you're seed growers, and you're the first conduit really for the producer to start growing those new varieties. And I think there's some responsibility there perhaps to engage the people who you're selling seed to talk about these problems and, just get people thinking about it, ask for solutions. It's pretty obvious we can't remain with the status quo. Things are going to change. And if we can't drive the change, it's going to be forced upon us. And I think that's the worst case scenario. If we can shape the change, we'll be far better off than if it's thrust upon us.
Curtis, I feel like we can learn a little bit from you here because, we've talked about various mechanisms to get, funding, different royalties, things like that. And the CDC already partners with seed companies to commercialize new varieties. In turn, the CDC receives royalties that are invested directly back into its research and breeding activities. And then what can us, the seed sector, learn from what you're doing as we craft this strategy for the future?
Right, yeah. So maybe those that don't know, so the CDC does collect royalties from our seed commercialization partners. The CDC doesn't commercialize. We partner with groups and stakeholders to commercialize our varieties, and we do receive royalties back on certified seed. It'd be similar with agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. One of the things that we do though at the CDC is we invest every single one of those royalty dollars back into our breeding programs. Every penny is invested back into the breeding programs. And so that is a source of revenue for our operations. In fact, we did take some of our royalties that we collected over the last couple of years and bought a new research farm near Aberdeen that really expanded our capacity for disease nursery testing and so on. So it is important to us that we have that investment coming into the programs. Now, in terms of VUA or endpoint royalties, the position of the CDC is one where we'll take direction from our industry partners on particularly our commercialization partners. We have a number of stakeholders at the CDC, different crop kinds. It's different for each of the crop kinds. So we're taking very much an approach, a variety by variety basis, how we would like to commercialize those varieties, whether a VUA makes sense, whether an endpoint royalty makes sense. And that'll be based on a business case where we see that value is generated across the sector, first starting with the grower, with our stakeholders, and then ultimately to the center itself. So our policy is on a variety by variety basis and sort of considering a business case for an endpoint royalty or a variety use agreement. Regardless, those royalties that flow back into us, whether that be certified seed, VUA, endpoint royalty, those will be invested right back into the breeding programs. And we did hear some impressive returns on investment that are measurable, that we've measured at the Crop Development Center. So on average, $12 return for every dollar invested across all the crop kinds, $40 for pulses, 20 for cereals. This is significant. So those royalties that do flow back to us, we do invest back into the breeding program, and there's measurable impact in terms of return on investment to growers. So we need to get that message out a lot better. That royalties aren't a scary word. It's an investment, and we can measure that investment and the impact that it's had.
Before we do a little Q&A here, Ricky, I'll give you the last word. What do you need from us in this room in terms of action now to help U of A really prosper in terms of its plant breeding activities and educating the next generation of breeders?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Just to continue the discussion about what your needs are, and so that we can respond to your needs, because I think we're all in a market now where it's market driven. It's not the days of university researchers doing research and going, gee, I think it's a good idea. I think somebody will like it. It's a rarity now. We have to be output driven. And, my son, who's an engineer, I admire engineers because they figure out what the problem is and then they reverse engineer a solution. And I think we need to take that approach. We also need to, Mark, and we've heard a lot about return on investment. We need to change how innovation is rewarded at universities and at government institutions. Because the standard metrics for academics is, you can well imagine papers published, the amount of grant money you get, things like that. When it comes to patents and licensing agreements, it's still a tough road. And I'll give you an experience. I sit on the scientific advisory panel for ag research in New Zealand, the equivalent to AAFC. Those researchers who have done some really creative things, who have gotten a patent or a license, there's not much latitude for them to be rewarded in the system. You know what happens? They leave. They start up their own companies, or they join a company because that's where they're seeing a reward. And finally, I'll just say, Mark, I had a discussion with Chuck Strahl when he was ag minister. And Chuck said to me, how do you figure, or what's the solution of getting return to the growers? Because the value chain, it's not a continuous line, it's interrupted. Most of that value happens post-farm gate, and how do you get it right back to the growers? And Jody, I love the statistics, but man, it could be way bigger, right? Mm-hmm. If the other end of the value chain contributed down to the growers. And so we need to figure out how to do that better. So the return on the investment, as Rob was saying, really goes to the people who created that innovation.